Today, the U.S. reported a record high number of new coronavirus cases. And now, some states, cities, and companies are reevaluating their reopening plans. Also, the campaign for advertisers to boycott Facebook is growing. And finally, a deep dive into a new study on how the pandemic has affected a massive chunk of the workforce, Millennials and Gen Z. I'm MacKenzie Sigalos, and this is CNBC After Hours. Let's start off with a look at Wall Street's day. It was a volatile one, but stocks still finished in the green, fresh off yesterday's dismal performance, when the Dow tumbled more than 700 points. The S&P is in the red so far this week, as U.S. coronavirus numbers have surged, reaching a single-day high for new cases. Outbreaks have gotten so bad in some states that the New York tri-state area, which has driven down their own case count, has put a mandatory quarantine in place for people coming from 8 hotspot states. Travelers coming to New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut from places like Florida, Arizona, and Texas, a state where ICU beds are now in short supply, will be subject to a 14-day quarantine upon arrival. Due to the increase in cases and hospitalizations, the governor of Texas announced today that the state is pausing its entire reopening effort. And COVID-19's resurgence has caused other public officials and corporations to rethink their reopening strategies. Tirrell has been running point on CNBC's coronavirus coverage, and she has all the latest details.
The United States is starting to see record numbers of new cases of the coronavirus in the last few days now. States like California, Florida, and Texas reporting record numbers of cases. The test positive rate across the United States is also rising, meaning that the increase in case numbers can't just be attributed to testing alone. And now this is raising some questions from public health experts about whether some states and counties should look at either pausing their reopening or even reverting to earlier, more stringent mitigation steps. If you look across the country, you are not seeing a whole lot of that, even though the CDC, in its guidelines on the federal guidance for reopening, says that there should be a low threshold for reinstating more stringent mitigation standards. They say that'll be essential given the potential for a rebound in the number of cases or level of community transmission. Now, what we're actually seeing is that any states or counties that are taking these kinds of measures are really pausing what they're doing instead of reverting to more stringent measures like lockdowns again. Sometimes we see entire states doing this, like North Carolina, Nevada, Louisiana, or Maine, or just counties in different states like Washington, Oregon, California, Florida, and Kansas. Except in Idaho, the county that encapsulates Boise actually did tell their bars and clubs that they had to close again after being open for less than a month due to concern about the spread of coronavirus there. And just today, around concerns about hospital ICU capacity, Texas told 4 counties that they have to ban elective surgeries for now as well in order to make room for potential COVID patients. So while we're not seeing a return to lockdowns being talked about just yet, public health officials are warning we might need to start thinking about that again if things continue in this direction. So corporate decision-making, it can be influenced by what the cities or the counties or states are doing. So in the example of Disney, talking about the California reopening, the company saying that it's the state not moving forward with their rules for amusement parks that's delaying their opening there. But then you have companies like Apple, which seem to be really taking matters into their own hands, looking at the trends and deciding to reclose stores in areas even where the city, county, or state isn't mandating it. So we saw them close 11 stores last week, and yesterday making that decision in Houston, where of course today, we're hearing that they are starting to take actions in their hospitals. So sometimes it's the corporations that are acting, even if the municipalities aren't.
Okay, let's get to our sound check. Here's a roundup of the day's biggest action and what the top newsmakers and business leaders had to say on CNBC's airwaves today.
Well, I think it's going to be difficult now to get this under control. The New York City announced their stay-at-home order on March 20th. That was a Friday. It went into effect that Sunday. And they didn't peak in the number of cases that they recorded, which was 7,000, which was less than what California recorded yesterday until, I believe, April 7th. So almost 3 weeks went by between the time that they put in place that stay-at-home order and the peak number of infections. So we know that there's a delay between the implementation of policy and actually affecting the scope of the epidemic. So whatever these states do right now is really going to help them in about 2 weeks, maybe a little bit longer than that.
What you're starting to see is a pretty noted bifurcation between those stocks that are starting to see really strong performance. For example, in the supply chain logistics sector, financial technology, digital health and wellness. But on the other side, you're seeing a sharp dip in consumer demand coming from retail, hospitality, travel industry. So the interesting thing about COVID and the lockdown is it's actually created a bifurcation driven by digitization in the lockdown as much as the economic impact on the economy.
I think Stop Hate for Profit, which is the name of the boycott, now includes, I think, roughly a dozen major advertisers. So Patagonia, North Face, REI, Upwork, and a couple of ad agencies like Goodby Silverstein, fashion retailers like Eileen Fisher and Ben & Jerry's and things like that. There's no way it's going to affect the numbers at Facebook. I mean, no advertiser at Facebook is even 1% of the revenue.
Well, true crime is actually the largest genre in podcasting, so you're not alone. And what we see is that true crime tends to be a gateway genre, which means we wind up seeing people come into podcasting through true crime, and then they migrate and try other types of podcasts and other types of genres. When you look at the growth of the medium, it's hard to deny. And not only is it growing so rapidly, it's the fastest growing medium right now. And when you look at the median age of who's listening to podcasts, you'll see that it's the youth, the young generations that are really driving this trend.
As coronavirus infections in the U.S. hit record high levels, the country's economic pain is persisting as well. This morning, we learned that 1.5 million people started to file for unemployment claims last week, more than economists were expecting. And the pandemic is weighing heavily on the largest portion of the U.S. labor force, Millennials and Generation Z. Deloitte's annual Millennial Survey was released today, and CNBC's Kate Rooney dove into those numbers.
Younger generations are reporting higher job losses, less financial optimism, and changing views of the workplace during the pandemic. According to Deloitte's annual Millennial Survey out today, about 2 in 3 Millennials and Gen Zs say they, quote, often worry or get stressed about their financial situations. Deloitte did an initial survey in December, then followed up in May to measure responses during the pandemic. Pessimism about finances grew by 9 percentage points during those first few months of 2020. 61% of respondents now see their financial situations worsening over the next year. The pandemic also bringing a surge in job losses among these generations. According to that follow-up survey, 30% of Gen Zs and a quarter of younger millennials aged 25 to 30 lost a job or were put on leave. The crisis is changing the way they view the workplace as well. More than 60% said that when the pandemic is over, they'd like the option to work remotely more frequently. So to put this in context, this makes up a big percentage of the workforce. Gen Z is about 20 to 24 years old, so they are in these entry-level positions. And millennials now are rising to the ranks of sort of senior vice president. Some of them are as old as 38, 40. So they are making up a big percentage of the global workforce.
Now for today's numbers round. We'll start with $1.4 billion. The federal government sent $1.4 billion in stimulus checks to more than 1 million dead Americans, according to a new report from the Government Accountability Office. Now, the finding is part of the watchdog's sweeping review of the federal response to COVID-19 and the rollout of the $2 trillion CARES Act. Next, 3,900. Macys is slashing 3,900 corporate jobs, roughly 3% of its workforce, in order to reduce costs as the department store tries to weather the economic turbulence of the coronavirus. The company closed all its stores in March and began reopening some of them in the beginning of May. Its famous Herald Square store in New York City was able to reopen this week. Macys says it expects to save around $365 million through layoffs this fiscal year. And finally, 6. 6 organizations, including the Anti-Defamation League and the NAACP, called on advertisers to temporarily boycott Facebook to protest, quote, a company that puts profit over safety. So companies like Patagonia, The North Face, and Ben & Jerry's have all joined the campaign. And today, a major advertising agency has signed on too. Goodby Silverstein, an agency with a client list including BMW, PayPal, Pepsi, Doritos, and Adobe, has joined the campaign and announced it will stop posting ads on Facebook for the month of July. Facebook said in a statement that it respects any brand's decision and that it will continue the work of removing hate speech on its platform. That's it for After Hours, but before we go, here's one more thing to keep an eye on. Third time's the charm for grocery chain Albertsons. At least that's the hope. The company, which also owns Acme, Safeway, and Shaw's, is set to IPO after 2 failed attempts since 2015. Get up-to-the-minute developments on Albertsons share pricing and first trades by going to CNBC.com and downloading the CNBC app. We'll be right here in our home office every Tuesday and Thursday with a new edition of After Hours, so be sure to catch us then.